All right, well, welcome to our second evening seminar. Thank you all for coming. Tonight we have Marci Revelli. She runs the Augmentative and Alternative Communication Program at Seattle Children's Hospital and also has her own private practice here in the Seattle area. And she's going to be sharing her wealth of knowledge about AAC funding with us. So take it away, Marci.
Thank you, Casey. So just a little bit of housework. Housework, yes.
Housekeeping.
Housekeeping. The handouts are available on the website, and I encourage you guys to download those handouts. The slide deck is pretty wordy, and I did that so that you wouldn't have to take a lot of notes, and then you could refer back to the slide deck following the presentation. We are offering CE for this in terms of getting a certificate. So at the end of the presentation, we'll put a link in the chat. And if you click on that link, you fill out a short survey, and then we'll send you out that CE certificate. So as the slide says here, this is AAC funding. And hold on 1 second, I'm just going to get rid of all these little thumbnails. Okay, perfect. There we go. Okay, here are our agenda and objectives. We're going to try to describe different funding sources for acquiring a speech device. I'm hoping we'll cover the topic of understanding and using funding specific vocabulary when writing reports. I'm hoping this presentation will help you understand the needed information that you need for report writing, and then also to be able to understand and take steps for overturning denials. We're diving right in. This slide shows different funding sources. This is my own way of thinking about how to clump different funding sources. We have private health insurance, and these are your regions: Premera, Aetna, Kaiser, United Healthcare, and so forth. Federal health insurance, which really is private, but it's federal. So there's TRICARE, which is our military insurance for military, and then Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield. Then we have the topic of our public health insurance, which includes Medicare and Medicaid. And for my own knowledge, I separate Medicaid, and then Medicaid has something called Managed Care Organizations, or MCOs. So you might hear of these as United Healthcare, Molina, or Apple Health. Then there's grant funding. We're going to talk about some grants. DDA funding, which is the Developmental Disabilities Administration. And that's what Casey and I were talking about at the start before y'all logged in. So if you heard that conversation. There is funding through vocational rehabilitation programs, the telecommunications equipment distribution programs, or EDPs. There's always out of pocket, and then there's public school funding. So we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. The first thing I always do, always, is you ask a family what health insurance they have. And then the second thing I always do is I always ask, does your child have a secondary insurance? And do you have any other sources of funding, such as DDA? Now, you would think that this is obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I'll ask these second two questions and families will say to me, oh yeah, right, we do have something, right? So they often need a reminder, especially if like they have a private insurance that has good coverage, then they typically don't remember or have need to state that they have a secondary insurance. So it's just always good to ask all three of those questions. Let's talk about private health insurance. There are different types of private health insurance, such as employer-sponsored plans. Microsoft has an employer-sponsored plan, or individually purchased plans, such as those that you might find on the insurance exchange. What I do is I suggest that families get a copy of their policy or plan. And specifically, what they're looking for is the terminology durable medical equipment or DME coverage, and then speech generating device or SGD coverage and exclusions. So families will call, and then I'll say to them, go ahead and call, but then get it in writing. And if somebody has their microphone on, if they can mute. So don't just call, get it in writing. And this is what I ask the families to do. Generally speaking, a private health insurance will cover, my ballpark is always 60 to 80%. Though depending on the private insurance, sometimes it's 0, sometimes it's 20%, and sometimes it's 100%. And then the remainder of that is the family's responsibilities in terms of copays and deductibles. Now, none of this information stops me from submitting for through health insurance, a private health insurance, but it's important to have the conversation with the family to suggest alternative funding sources if needed. So when I'm starting an AAC evaluation and I think the child's a good candidate for a device, I will find out what insurances they have. And if they only have a single private health insurance, then I'll explain to them, well, your copay could be quite substantial. And then we'll talk about the pros and cons of moving forward. Next is federal health insurance. As I mentioned, TRICARE is what active and retired military are covered under. And we have a lot of military here in Washington state. And then the Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield, both of them cover speech generating devices. Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield also shows up in Washington state. I've seen it, for example, on postal carriers. So postal workers have a Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield coverage. Historically, they've covered devices, but it's always good to know when this comes, when I see this, because there have been changes sometimes to these policies. And so there's no issues with them. They do cover them. But if you do get a denial, it could be an indication of something that's larger than just state, than just a local issue. And I'll explain that a little bit further on. We're going to talk about public health insurance. There's Medicare, which is typically adults age 65 or older. It can show up for those who are younger, though. I think in my 20-year career of working at Seattle Children's, I've worked with one Medicare recipient who was 16. Then there's Medicaid, which is typically income-based, low-income, pediatric population, and or a child with disability. And in the past, Medicaid has required very specific forms when funding a speech device, and those forms are listed here on this slide. The reason why I point that out, though, is that more recently, in the past 3 to 5 years, Medicaid's managed care organizations, or MCOs, have taken over most Medicaid cases. So I would say now, 90% of the kids that have Medicaid have a Medicaid MCO. And the Medicaid MCOs don't require those forms. There are small differences in the MCOs, United Healthcare, Molina, Apple. It doesn't affect what you do if you're thinking about health insurance. We provide the same quality of care for every child or adult independent of insurance that they have. That should be on its own slide, right? This is a slide I put in just for your reference that shows the differences in Medicare and Medicaid. And I'm not going to talk at all about this except for here on the bottom, the last line item that says claims are submitted by the manufacturer or supplier, and then my call out that the speech generating device vendors are our biggest allies. And what I mean by that is that the companies that we work with to get speech generating device funding through health insurance, they want to see us succeed, and they have given so many resources on their websites that you should feel like you can go to the website and they're going to support you even if you're not sure what to submit when. Now, having said that, the second line that says what documents are required as part of a claim, if you look at the speech, the Medicaid column, it says you're required to do a speech language report and a doctor's prescription. And this is true. These are the two most important documents. As a speech pathologist who's doing AAC evaluations, we get these two documents. One of the things, though, that I like to point out is that there are several other documents that are needed for an AAC funding packet. These include every vendor has a client information form. All vendors require an AOB, which is an assignment of benefits form that the parent signs. And this is a form that allows the vendor and the insurance company to talk to each other. All of the vendors require a front and back copies of the family's insurance cards. Sorry, that's number 3. And then I have also listed their doctor's notes and doctor's referrals. So I want to point out these 7 documents because if you use the companies, the vendors' websites, and you submit forms to them, you're going to submit your report, you're going to submit the doctor's prescription, and then they're going to tell you, hey, we also need this form, this form, this form, and this form. At Seattle Children's, because there are slight differences in the insurances and what they require for documentation, we at Seattle Children's, we collate all 7 of these forms before we ever send it into the vendor. And we do that for a couple of reasons. We do that because in the past, there have been some providers, some speech folks out there who would give a family the report and the prescription and then say to them, we don't do the funding. And I feel like, and what I've seen is that this is an issue of equity and access and understanding. Families have a lot on their plates. And so even something like getting the front and back copies of their insurance cards loaded into the system might be difficult for a family if they don't have access to technology or they don't speak English. So at Seattle Children's, we just, as a matter of policy and practice, we get all 7 of these documents. The client information form, the assignment of benefits, copies of insurance cards, then my report and the doctor's prescription for the device and its accessories. And then we also do these other 2 things, which are required for for some state insurance, which is we try to dig up the original referral for the AAC evaluation, and then the doctor's notes that talk about how the child has a communication difficulty. And we do that because some insurances require that the child be seen by a doctor within 6 months of having the evaluation. And if this is the insurance that you're working with and you're working with this vendor, the vendor is going to tell you this. So you don't have to remember this. For some insurances, they'll say, hey, we are going to reach out to the doctor for you, or do you have a connection with this doctor? You can get their doctor's notes. Moving on. And before I move on, Casey, we didn't talk about questions. If you have questions, we would love for you to put those in the chat and we can kind of monitor them, but we're gonna have questions at the end. This program will run a deep hour. And then if you have to sign off, that's fine, but we'll stay on for as long as you have questions and have a discussion about all of this information, because I know it's a lot. Okay, this slide shows grant funding. Here in Washington State, we have access to a fund called Ben's Fund, which is for children with autism. Apraxia Kids is a national organization, but has limited yearly submissions and requires an apraxia diagnosis. We have Jordan Fund, which is, for me, it feels like a little well-kept secret. Jordan Fund for me is something that I might use as a very last resort. They are a local philanthropy here in Washington State. I'll give you a couple of examples. I've heard of families who have gone to them to remodel their bathroom to make it wheelchair accessible. I had a child who we got a device for, and then I found out that the child who walks, who's ambulatory, didn't actually have a good chair at home. And so we applied to Jordan Fund to get her an adapted chair. They cover hippotherapy camps. I had a family who went to them for Surface Pro and switches, and this was before now some of our vendors have this as an option to have a kind of a dedicated or packaged Surface Pro as a speech device. So just know that Jordan Fund is out there. What happens in these cases is we do the AAC evaluation, we write a report, and then most of the time we give that report to the family to submit to the grant. The family fills out other grant forms and then kind of puts that all together and mails it or emails it to the grant committee. Moving on to the DDA. I actually don't know a lot about what qualifies families for DDA. I do believe that it is income-based. It's always good to know that families have DDA. And if they do, what I do is I try to discuss with families the pros and cons of going through their health insurance to fund a device versus going through DDA money to fund a device. In my experience, the DDA money tends to be somewhere between, I'm going to say, $1,000 to $3,000. I could be way off there. That money is typically used for services that are not covered by Medicaid. So these are things like Pediasure, diapers, respite care, and then also assistive technologies. In this case, if a family has DDA money, we write a report and we give that report to the family to submit to their DDA case manager. If we're doing this, then there's some lingo that we have to use, which is we can say that we're asking for a tablet and an app to support activities of daily living. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. So now there are some other funding sources. Vocational rehab, which is a bucket of money that's used for folks, older teenagers, young adults, and then into adulthood, to access accommodations for employment or vocational opportunities. So this is access to assistive technology. And then we have the telecommunications equipment distribution programs, or EDPs. These are state monies, state-run programs that not every state has, but Washington State does. And our famed Provale here in Seattle has this program, and the link is provided on this slide. This is money that allows adaptive equipment for the purposes of using the telephone. You have out-of-pocket funding, of course, which we always talk about with families, and then public schools. Okay, so now here's a topic that we're going to dive into just a little bit. Schools. Schools are a possible speech generating device funding source, and this is stated in the laws. SGDs and related services such as AAC training are considered assistive technology services, and it's specified in IDEA. So once a school team decides that an SGD is appropriate, the school has a substantive duty to acquire and provide services and to integrate those services into the IEP. So you all know this, right? But the thing that I never really was quite clear on, and it is now absolutely clear to me, is that schools are not required to pay for needed SGD. Schools are not the most likely funding sources for speech devices, and schools are not even really the best funding source for speech generating devices. But schools must be the speech device funding source when there are no other funding sources available. Schools can use other funding sources so as not to dip into schools' resources. And if a school wants to use other funding sources, they need to just get families' consent to ensure that the family won't incur any out-of-pocket costs. This is lingo that comes straight from ASHA and some of our other AAC funding webinars that are out there on AAC websites, and those links and more information are in the references at the end of the slide deck. But just so you know, health insurances cannot deny claims submitted by school personnel. Medicaid and other public benefits can't alter their scope of coverage or their eligibility criteria in any way that changes the benefits that are available to a person with disabilities just because they are school aged. So if you get a denial that says this is a educational need, you can argue that they can't change their criteria simply because the child is in school. Medicaid cannot refuse to provide services otherwise covered just because they're stated on the student's IEP. And then in terms of private health insurance, they cannot refuse to provide care that would otherwise be provided by somebody who's not affected by IDEA. So they can't pick and choose just because a child has special education services, what they cover or don't cover. So in summary, the questions that you ask yourself about funding are: which funding source is the most straightforward path to yes? Which funding source will make the decision the fastest? Which funding source will pay the most? Those three are pretty typical to what you see in our literature. And then I have this fourth question, which is pretty important when I'm thinking about where I'm going to go for funding, which is: what is the purpose of obtaining this equipment? When we talk about health insurance funding, we are talking about getting money for a dedicated or a locked speech device that can only be used for communication purposes. But if a family wants to use the equipment, not just for let's say an app on a tablet, if the family wants to use it for other apps, then that can't be possible in a dedicated speech device. There can only be one app for communication purposes. If you're looking at grants or DDA funding, you can look at a tablet. There's more flexibility. For example, I had a patient last week who was verbal, but low expressive receptive language, and they came in looking for different apps for visual supports. As an example, this child had difficulty initiating, and so he would default and initiate to the same two topics. And when we pulled out a text-based app, which had some alternate topic statements, he was able to read and select the topic that he wanted to, different than what he could do verbally. And he was able to do this with also with emotions. If you just said, "How are you?" he would say, "Good." But if you showed him a list of 10 different text-based emotion words, he could then actually choose the more precise word for how he was feeling. So what the purpose for obtaining the equipment has to do with which health insurance goodness gracious, which funding source you might choose. In summary, for this part, it's important that there is collaboration between family, medical, and educational systems. It's important for us to explain the retail costs of dedicated devices versus out-of-pocket costs. And what I mean by that is if a family has a private health insurance and nothing else, there is a markup on speech generating devices through our vendors that we use. And so if you go to the Apple store and you buy a tablet and a case and an app, you're looking at a ballpark of $700 to $800 out of pocket. But because there's a markup on these systems going through the vendors, the retail cost could be $3,500. And so a 20% copay on $3,500 is $700. So I explain this to families, and then I explain why they might want to go with a dedicated device and put their money in that direction versus just going to the Apple store. I also help families understand the differences between owning the system versus schools owning the system, and then having two systems versus one system. And then working together, we collaborate in order to make the best decision. Okay, I'm going to check my watch. Great. I wanted to pull up our evidence-based practice triangle and then point out a few things to consider when you're thinking about AAC funding. We're going to start with the pink clinical expertise side of the triangle. We all, as AAC providers, come to our AAC assessments with bias. And I feel like it's very helpful for all of us to own our own bias as it comes to AAC apps and devices and companies, um, in order to best get a good fit for the patient or the student that you're working with. Um, when I think about bias, here's how I think about it, which is when I'm running an AAC evaluation, and let's say you have a child who can use their hands and can touch pictures on a screen and needs a robust vocabulary, I'm going to run through robust AAC apps. But I know myself, and I know that some of the apps I'm less familiar with than some of the other apps. And what often happens is if I'm less familiar with the app, then I struggle with finding the vocabulary to model in situ, right? Like in the context of working with the child and staying on the topic that they want to talk about. And I pull up an app, and then I'm like, oh, but I can't find the picture that I want. So that difficulty then is communicated to the child and the parent, and they have a different experience of that app as compared to some of the other apps. So I just feel like it's important to then acknowledge that maybe what I tried to do with that particular app didn't work out quite well. And then I might use that app with vocabulary that's more familiar to me so that I can model it better. So acknowledging your bias, I think, is super important. In the bottom part of the triangle, the evidence-based, there's so much evidence for AAC and device use and supporting successful device use. The bucket of evidence that I want to talk about here is our device abandonment evidence. And this is a pretty robust bucket that talks about why are devices abandoned. We know in part some of the biggest predictors of device abandonment are not including the child or the parent, the AAC user or the caregivers in the decision-making process, not having them try the different devices to get buy-in for that device in the home setting, and then not providing carryover or training in terms of follow-up. And so moving on to the third part of the triangle then is that it's super important to have the conversations with the families about these more subtle qualitative aspects of what you think might make a device successfully used in the home. For example, how comfortable are they with technology? Do they have a particular cultural perspective or they don't allow screens in their home at all, and then the other kids, the other siblings would be offended if one sibling had a screen, right? So what kinds of access to supports? How is school supporting the family? Do they have? So all of these questions help me form a picture of what I'm going to recommend. I'll give you another example. If I decide that that child I mentioned before who has direct selection, and let's say we decide on the app Touch Chat Word Power. Well, I now have 2 or 3 different vendors I can go to. How do I know which vendor to choose? In some cases, I might think to myself, well, this is a family and a school district who really needs some local support for training and carryover and instruction. And we have here in Washington State 3 local vendor reps And so I might choose to go with one company that has a local vendor rep, specifically because I know that that vendor rep will come out to the school or come out to the family to help them and support them. On the other hand, if that family is really comfortable with technology, and let's just say it's October and they've met all their copays and deductibles, and they really want to move this through as quickly as possible, I might choose to go with a different vendor because I know that that first vendor might be super slow. They're kind of slow, but this other vendor is actually usually really fast. So having these conversations with the parents and considering our evidence-based triangle allows us to make the best decisions for how to move forward with choosing a vendor and then choosing a funding source. Okay. We are moving on at lightning speed into report writing. What do I write? Well, the good news, if you don't do this very often, is that all the SGD vendors have templates. And so you can go out to these websites and they will allow you to download a template and help you figure out what to say in each of these sections. Some of the vendors will also review your report. They can provide suggestions. They can tell you what's missing, what you might want to change or add. So remember, they are our biggest allies and they want us to succeed. So they support us. When you write your report, the terminology in your report depends on the funding source. If you are choosing to get the funding through schools or vocational rehabilitation, you can use the term rehabilitation technology or assistive technology. If you are choosing to use health insurance, the terminology is durable medical equipment or DME, and then dedicated speech generating devices. And dedicated, just a note on that, dedicated is a term we use when the device is delivered in a locked state so that it only functions for communication purposes. The vendors do have open speech generating devices. As a matter of practice at Seattle Children's, though, I don't know the ins and outs of which health insurances allow you to have open versus dedicated devices. And so in all cases, I will recommend a dedicated speech generating device. For Washington State DDA, you need to talk about communication in the context of activities of daily living. And if you are looking at the EDP programs, the telecommunications programs, you can use the term specialized telephone communication equipment. For health insurance coverage, I try to keep words like school, classroom, education out of my narrative. And I don't use iPad, tablet, or computer at all in the body of my report. So one of the things I did for this presentation that I've always wanted to do is I pulled the different templates from 4 different templates from different vendors, and I laid them out and I looked to see what do they all have in common, and then what is it about the Seattle Children's reports that might be different. And so over this next couple slides, we're going to go through all of the headers that are in black, the bullet points that are in black. These are things that all the templates have in common. The things that are in red are things that Seattle Children's does a little bit differently that I'll explain why we do that. And then there are some items that are bolded, and I'll talk about those at the end. So for your report, we all do what we would typically do when we're writing a speech and language evaluation, right? We put the basic information, the evaluation site, the history, the medical background, a statement of their gross and fine motor status, and a statement of their hearing and vision status. At Seattle Children's, we decided recently to add a statement of their oral motor and eating status. In particular, if a child has a significant dysphagia or is G-tube fed, that is useful information when I go to explain medical justification. So I make a statement about their oral motor eating status so that I can draw on it later in the report. At Seattle Children's, we put in a current communication status section, which really is in your SLP report, like, why is this child coming in? I like to give a snapshot to the insurance companies of what current communication looks like without any AAC. So what do they do with their speech? Do they talk? Do they not talk? Are they intelligible? Are they not intelligible? Have they tried some sign language? Have they tried some basic picture use? What works for them? What doesn't work? How do they answer yes, no? How do they make requests? Things like that. So I do a very brief current communication status at the beginning of my report, as well as a statement that talks about families' current concerns. And then, of course, we dive into the assessment. The templates from our AAC vendors don't actually require that you have a statement about behavior. We put in how did they participate, what was their sensory state, and of course, the statement of validity. And then we cover communication assessment. We talk about speech, speech intelligibility, expressive and receptive language. Thank you, Allison. We sometimes do standardized assessments, and sometimes we do informal. I have been called out on using the term informal in terms of insurance funding. So what I will say is speech or speech intelligibility, for example, was observed as follows. And then I'll describe if I'm doing just an observation or informal analysis of their speech and speech intelligibility. And if I'm doing formal testing, then I'll note that. For the next 4 sections, cognitive assessment, motor assessment, vision, and hearing, you'll see in parentheses that I've written relating to AAC. I think sometimes this feels super daunting to folks that have to do this huge battery of testing. So this is a reminder that you don't have to do that. What you do have to do is look at their cognitive ability as it relates to AAC, and then just describe what you see. So you would make statements of their ability to learn and retain and recall their memory for using a device. How do they attend to the device? How are they engaged with the device and then engaged with their partner? What is their symbol recognition in terms of the ability to look at different kinds of picture symbols and understand and use them? What is their literacy level? And then we also would look at motor and vision and hearing as it relates to AAC. Again, describing what you see. For motor, what is their access? How do they use their hands? What hand do they use? How are they seated? And so the purpose of this discussion isn't to go into the details of assessment, But just to note that this is the section that you put in the report where you are describing what you see as it relates to their ability to access their speech device. Vision assessment, how do they see what's in front of them? Do they need that backlit screen? Do they need bigger pictures? Can they see smaller pictures? Or in a they need more of a limited visual field. So these are the things that you're going to be describing in each of these sections. In the hearing section, I often will make statements relating to how they hear and process the voice output. And if in fact they use that voice output to then speak, which a lot of our students, our kids do, or if they use that voice output to then self-correct if they hear that they've made an error. Next slide. Oops. There we go. Then we will look at their daily communication needs and their limitations of current methods of communication. This is something that all the templates and Seattle Children's puts in their reports. The next section is rationale for device selection. And I feel like that statement is a little bit misleading and might cause you to think that you've selected a device and now you have to explain the rationale for that device. So to me, that statement feels a little bit more top down. What this section is really asking for is bottom up. It's asking for you to describe the AAC system characteristics, the features that you've discovered are important features that are going to go into the device that you select. Seattle Children's, we include a statement of AAC systems that we considered but that we ruled out. And this targets the question of why won't less costly treatments work? And these are things that we, I think, as speech therapists might take for granted, like speech. We're going to rule out continuing to work on speech because this child is nonverbal and they're 16, and we're going to explain the rationale for that. Sign language. This child does not have the capacity to use their hands to learn sign language. This child's not hearing impaired. This family is not fluent in sign language. So we're going to rule that out. It's not that we tried it. We're not even going to try it. We're going to rule it out because we know that it's not going to work. Another example might be the picture exchange system. We know that a child might need access to a robust vocabulary, a child that already has access to a few spoken words to ask for foods and toys so they can already request. Well, we're going to rule out the picture exchange system because their language needs surpass where they could go in that system. So I want you to think about, it's not that you have to try all these things and then rule them out, that it's important to actually state some of these other things that you've considered and ruled out. And then we have a section on trials with equipment. What did you try, for how long, where, with whom, and what were the results? And typically a trial should be at least 4 weeks. That one is in bold because there's one insurance that will deny if you don't specifically state that you have run at least a 4-week trial. And so in my reports now, I'm very explicit. Trials were run. They started on this date and they ended on this date. For a school district, that might mean that the student was given a device and used it every day from the beginning of the school year until February. And so they've run trials daily from September to February. So it's important to spell out the specifics of what equipment and for how long did you try it. And then all the templates, including Seattle Children's, you have your summary section. Personally and professionally, I like to keep this section very specific to the patient. So it doesn't have a lot of jargon in it that's really needed for the insurance piece. I like to summarize the patient so that they are a person. So the parent who's reading this can really see their child shine as a person with their strengths and some of their challenges. Then there's a section on the recommended device and its accessories, a section for including functional communication goals with criterion. And then Seattle Children's has this section, which is medical justification, which is where I dump in everything that is all the lingo that we would need to support a speech device as a medical necessity. For example, the patient's medical condition is one resulting in a severe expressive speech impairment. The patient's speech needs cannot be met using natural communication. Without a speech device, the patient cannot communicate with anyone at any time in any location or on any topic. Then we write a treatment plan, and a treatment plan is really, for those of you who aren't in clinics or hospitals, it's really what's going to happen next. How is the client, the student, the patient going to be supported? What is the physician's involvement? You're going to reach out to that physician to have them sign a prescription. And what is the initial training and ongoing training so that the insurance companies can see that you're considering a plan once the device is funded. You make a statement of non-conflict that you don't have any financial connections to any of the device vendors. You sign it with your credentials and you date it. Phew, so that is the overview of the AAC report. I'm going to back up now. It's here. So some of these things that were bolded, these are places where I've gotten dinged and denied through health insurance. And so I just wanted to point them out for examples. I was denied once because the insurance company wanted to only use a specific vendor. And because I had listed the features, I was able to then go in and say, well, in fact, the device that I'm recommending has these 5 features, and the company that you want me to use can only meet the requirements of 3 of those features. So that was super helpful in terms of helping me overturn a denial. I mentioned the 4-week information for some of the insurances. I got denied once because I forgot to put criterion, and the insurance company said, hey, these aren't goals, you need to write criterion. And so I wrote an appeal and added that. Note to self. Severe expressive speech impairment. A lot of the insurance companies want to hear severe speech disorder, severe speech impairment. And if you don't say that something is severe, they don't think it's severe enough. In the bolded line item that's without an SGD, the patient cannot communicate with anyone at any time in any location. This is something that I just recently started to add in because I had a denial for a child who maybe had like 100, 200 word vocabulary of 90% intelligibility by the family, but 50% intelligibility by everybody else. And the insurance company didn't understand why this was a problem. And so this particular statement speaks to the fact that they can't communicate with everybody at any time, in any location, on any topic. And then finally, credentials. It is important that the doctors have MDs after their name and that we put our credentials as well. Okay, we're almost at the end. I'm gonna look at my watch. Denials. Denials are no big deal. Really, they're no big deal. You get a denial, and what I want to do is show you how I break it down so that you can feel like you can address a denial and write an appeal. Well, the first thing you do is you get the denial in writing, and you address only the specific issues that are stated in the denial, no more and no less. If needed, I will look at the specific policy for this DME and SGD coverage or exclusions. And this is usually for private insurance only. If a family got their insurance on the exchange, let's say, there might just be something really specific that says speech devices are excluded. So I'm looking for specific wording. If indicated, you're going to change your wording to address the denial in the appeal. Sometimes insurances just want to pick on something that you've already stated, so you just restate what you've already stated, and you follow the appeals process as described in the policy or plan. So this is a specific denial letter from insurance, and I want to show you how I pull out the line items for what I'm going to address. And I'm going to read this because it's a little bit wordy, but I'll read it fast. The criteria must be met to approve this request. One of the criteria include having a full exam done by a speech therapist called a speech language pathologist, or SLP. There must also be notes to show support of extended care while using this device. This includes a treatment plan after the initial 60 days. The notes sent to us do not provide this. Other criteria include notes showing there is no equally effective, more conservative, or less costly treatment or items available. This includes notes of other options tried and ruled out. The notes show you only tried the products of one company. This is not sufficient evidence that other companies' devices would not be effective and less costly. The criteria are not met. This is why the request is denied. And so how I pull this out is there were 5 points that you can pull from that paragraph. Number 1, full exam done by a speech pathologist. As you will see, and I'm responding as if I'm writing an appeal letter, as you will see, the 5-page report that was submitted to you was completed by myself on such and such a date. I am a licensed speech language pathologist. Notes to show support of extended care while using this device. As you can see on page 5, I have a plan of care that shows what will happen on how this child will be supported with device use following its funding. A treatment plan after the initial 60 days. So in this particular example, they were asking for information that I had already given them. So I was simply pointing it back out to them. As you can see on page 5, this information was provided to you. The last line item, notes show you only trialed the products of one company. Well, that was true. So I didn't do a very good job of explaining that I had tried 3 different robust communication applications. And so I didn't parse that out well enough. And then I addressed that in my appeal letter.